This is Democracy,
a podcast about the people of the United States.
A podcast about citizenship,
about engaging with politics and the world around you.
A podcast about educating yourself on today's important issues
and how to have a voice in what happens next.
Welcome to our new episode of This is Democracy. After a short summer break, we are back to our weekly routine. Is it good to be back, Zachary?
Definitely.
And today we are taking on, I think, what is one of the biggest and most complicated issues in our society, one that I think underpins all of our political conflicts, all of our social conflicts today, one way or another. And it's the issue of inequality in our criminal justice system. The United States, as most of our listeners know, and as we've talked about in prior podcasts, is a country that imprisons more people than any of our other democratic industrial peers. We're also a country that has a long, long history of inequality, racism, and other injustices and inequities in the ways that we handle criminal justice. And by some accounts, those inequities have become worse in recent years. We're joined today by a scholar and practitioner who has spent much of her career both dealing with these issues as a lawyer and studying them as a scholar. This is Vida Johnson. She is an associate professor of law at Georgetown University. And prior to joining Georgetown, she was a supervising attorney in the trial division at the Public Defender Service for the District of Columbia. And there she was assigned some of the most serious cases in what are known as the Felony 1 level. Her experiences included numerous trials in D.C. Superior Court representing indigent clients facing charges including homicide, sexual assault, and many other armed offenses. Vida's responsibilities have included supervising various other trial attorneys and serving as one of the agency's representatives to the D.C. Superior Court on sentencing guidelines. So she spent a lot of time thinking about and debating these issues. At Georgetown, she's been writing about these issues as well. And we will include with today's podcast a link to a recent, very powerful piece that Vida wrote for Lawfare called Policing and the Siege of the United States Capitol. Vida, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Before we get into our discussion with Professor Vida Johnson, we have, of course, Mr. Zachary's scene-setting poem. What's the title of your poem today?
Prayer of the Unjustly Imprisoned.
Let's hear it.
Behind Swedish draperies, we waltz and waltz. We hold each other in a cold and empty room. We can feel each other's hearts, his pulse, his pulse. We weave our days carefully, threads upon a loom. In the window the sun shines today, each day. We look up from the iron depths and watch the light. We ask the same thing, come what may, that it may still be shining when we leave. Warm and bright. Ask me who is innocent or right. We're right, that they have told us this is freedom when it's hate. That it doesn't matter who is right, we're right. Just keep the truth hidden here, rotting in the crate. Behind Swedish draperies, we waltz and waltz. They don't look at us at all, we will bloom. They think that we're missing, that they win. False and false. They'll disappear into the earth. We will bloom.
Wow, that's powerful, Zachary. What is your poem about?
My poem is really about two things. First of all, the experience of the unjustly imprisoned, the terror of being imprisoned either for a crime that you didn't commit or being imprisoned for an unjust length of time in unjust conditions for a crime one did commit. And twofold, that the society of the United States today uses prison in order to hide the poverty and our own failings. And instead of using prison as a way to improve our society, we use it as a way to ignore the bigger problems that we face, and we leave the true culprits, the true injustice unanswered.
Vida, before we talk about your recent writings on many of these issues, your impressions of Zachary's assertions?
Oh, I could not agree more. Absolutely. And I think part of the conversation we'll have about policing also highlights some of the issues that were discussed in the poem.
Great. So I thought we'd start actually with this really powerful recent article you wrote about January 6th. Many of us are thinking a lot about that day following not only the horror of what happened, but then, of course, the hearings that have been a major part of political discussion through the early part of the summer. And you argue that the heroic narrative about the Capitol Police is really only part of the story, that there's much more there, especially related to deeper issues of injustice in the criminal justice system. Can you summarize some of your arguments for us in that sense?
Sure. But before we get started, I just want to say a couple of things. I'm
Please.
absolutely going to say some things that are critical of police, but I want to say that I think the vast majority of people who get into policing do so for all the right reasons. And before we jump right into January 6th, I want to just lay the backdrop that I think probably all of your listeners know, but maybe haven't really thought about in the context of January 6th. And that's that police are entrusted with a lot of power. We give them weapons, we give them access to sensitive information, and they get specialized training to use against their neighbors, right? They're the only Americans authorized to use force legally against other Americans. So it's a lot of power and it's a lot of responsibility. And we shouldn't give this kind of power and responsibility to people who lack the critical thinking skills or ability to address threats adequately. And unfortunately, I think what we saw on January 6th shows that there are police officers who aren't really thinking clearly about a lot of things going on in modern American life. And so I think it's against that backdrop that we should think about January 6th. So both in the Lawfare article that you've mentioned and also a longer law review piece that I wrote and published in the Brooklyn Law Review, I make the argument that American policing was complicit in what happened on January 6th in 4 different ways. The first is that the Capitol Police didn't adequately prepare for what was going to happen on January 6th because they underestimated the threat that this white Trump-supporting crowd was to them. And that's unfortunately due to their own implicit racial biases. And keep in mind, it's January 6th feels like yesterday, but it also feels like a long time ago. But keep in mind that in 2020 and sort of mid to late 2020, there was a lot of things going on in American life that should have been clues to what was going to happen on January 6th. So if you remember the protests that were happening around police violence and racism and policing, there were a lot of militia groups, far-right militia groups that were making themselves known at these protests across the country. And then after the November elections, there were a number of militia groups and just regular, ordinary armed people showing up at voting locations and at vote counting locations. So we know that there was a lot of possibility for violence in this far right crowd. But unfortunately, the Capitol Police weren't ready for it. They didn't have the kinds of crowd control measures that they normally do for big groups and other protests that had happened recently back then. There weren't aerosols they could use to disperse the crowd. The police officers weren't in riot gear, so they didn't have head protection. And so there was just a lot of ways that they could have been able to disperse the crowd. And as a result of being unprepared, they ended up in hours of hand-to-hand combat with Americans who were trying to overthrow the election. results. So that's the first way, is that the Capitol Police underestimated the threat. Yeah.
So Vida, just on that point, because I think it's such a powerful point, and I have to say, until I read your piece, I hadn't thought about it that way. What is the evidence that was racial bias, not just incompetence?
Well, so I want to be clear, I'm talking about implicit racial bias. So
right.
This is not, police officers who, are consciously thinking racist thoughts. These are the sort of, it's sort of the implicit biases that all Americans and all humans have, to be more, to trust people that look like them more than people who don't. And so we know that generally law enforcement has underestimated the threat from far right groups. And it's just actually, in some ways, just natural human nature, right? We trust people that we can relate to more. And so we know that a lot of law enforcement are disproportionately white. And there was just a group that is more likely to see this crowd as non-threatening, as opposed to other big protests like the Black Lives Matter protests that police had been policing in the summer of 2020.
Right. So as I understand your argument, because I think this is such an important argument you're making, it's that this first argument is that if this had been a group of African American men and women coming to the Capitol in a similar way, that the police would have been far more prepared.
Absolutely, they would have seen them more as a threat. And there were lots of warnings from law enforcement around the country, from FBI field offices. They had ample notice that this group was going to be violent, and that they were looking for certain key members of Congress. And yet the police were not adequately prepared. They didn't even have, normally when there's a big protest, they call up people who have vacation or days off planned. They didn't do that. And there's just a lot of ways that they were unprepared for what happened on January 6th. And ultimately, things did not get under control until the Capitol Police called in the Metropolitan Police Department, which is the main District of Columbia Police Department. But I should tell you that the Capitol Police is actually pretty big. It's a police force the size of the San Diego's police department. And San Diego is a big city, and these are about 2,000 police officers to guard a couple of buildings. So I think your question really leads into the second way that law enforcement underestimated this group, and that's that they've been doing it for a long time. The police and law enforcement generally in this country have underestimated the threat from far-right groups, despite years of evidence that far-right extremism is one of the biggest terrorism threats that we face as a nation. We know that there were a lot of incidents taking place in America that should have, made law enforcement think more about the far right as being a threat, particularly on an important day like January 6th. I mean, as I mentioned, the groups of people that were at the vote counting locations, but you don't really have. There's more evidence of far right extremism before then. There were the shootings in El Paso. Just a few years before the mass shooting at synagogues, both in Pittsburgh and in San Diego. There had been the shooting at the Pulse nightclub in Florida. There are just a number of incidents that should have made law enforcement generally see the far right as a threat, but unfortunately, that hasn't been happening for quite some time. I really think until January 6th.
And if I may ask, what would you say to those who would argue that maybe this is because I think that there are many people who would at least instinctually think of these as separate issues, right? But the unpreparedness of police to respond to far right terrorism, as opposed to violence on the left, and then the racial inequalities within the criminal justice system. Uh, how are those connected?
Oh, well, I think they're very connected. Before we talk about modern policing, there's a long history of explicit racial bias in police departments. I mean, some of the first police departments in the United States were groups of white men who organized themselves to police the comings and goings of enslaved people and catch, what we now refer to as runaway slaves. We know that police allowed lynchings to take place for many, many years, sometimes on the courthouse steps, without a single arrest being ever made for that type of racial violence that went on in this country. We know that even if you just go back about 25 years, you can see that there were white supremacist groups in LA police departments. In Cleveland, Ohio in 1999, there were Nazi symbols found in every single precinct there.
Wow.
The list goes on and on. There were Texas police officers who were recruiting more officers for the KKK. So there's just a long history of racism and policing. There's also just been a rise in racial violence in this country, really since the election of Barack Obama in 2008. So it's really not hard to see that this sort of extreme thinking about racial subordination wouldn't end up on police, in police ranks as well, especially when you think about how attractive policing is to someone who holds that sort of explicit racial bias, right? Like you get to control the comings and goings of whole communities, really. You get to use violence against people. So you get specialized training. It's a very attractive profession to people who are interested in subordinating racial groups.
To me, Vida, reading your piece, what really startled and shook me was, I think it's your third argument, right? Which is that in fact there was a great deal of sympathy and maybe even encouragement for the actions of the insurrectionists, or some element of that, within the police forces at the time. Am I getting your argument right?
I think you are. I mean, so we know that there were Capitol Police that day that were sympathetic towards the group. There were a number of police officers who were investigated by the Capitol Police since then. We've all seen the selfies, right? We saw on January 6th and the days that followed those images of police officers who were pausing to take pictures with the insurrectionists. So we know that there were some Capitol Police that were sympathetic towards the group and maybe had the same political leanings. We know there was, I think it was an FBI agent who's being prosecuted now for helping some of the insurrectionists cover their tracks, saying, hey, look, they're investigating you. You should take down some of these social media posts. So, there's a lot of evidence that there were police officers who facilitated the attack within the Capitol Police. It's worth saying, though, that the Capitol Police is one of the most opaque police departments in the country. And so we actually don't know the details of some of those investigations. We don't know, whether anyone was fired or anything along those lines, because they're part of the legislation that authorizes that keeps the Capitol from being subject to FOIA. The Capitol Police are also not subject to the Freedom of Information Act. So we just have less information about them than we might about another police department.
And to clarify for our listeners, those of us who are scholars who study these issues, one of the things we rely on is the Freedom of Information Act and various other versions of that allow us at the state and federal level to get access to documents about state and federal institutions. And Vida's pointing out, I didn't know this, that the Capitol Police are an institution that's very difficult to get information out. I have the sense, though, that that's true for most police forces, though. Is that correct?
Yes and no. I mean, it is very difficult to get information about specifically police officer discipline. That's notoriously difficult to get information about. But Capitol Police are extra special in that way. We don't even know the demographics of the Capitol Police Department.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow. So just sort of zooming out a little bit, and I'm glad we started with January 6th because I think it allowed us to be specific and not platitudinous in what we're talking about here. But now that we have a case study, and of course there's much more in your article that you didn't have a chance to get to here, but zooming out, what are the implications for thinking about criminal justice and policing in our society? I feel, and I think many of our listeners might feel this way too, that our debate is often a very simplistic one. Are you pro-police or anti-police? And of course, you're not anti-police. I'm not anti-police,
right.
but there are problems there. So how should we think about this?
Well, I think this is really the question, right? How do we make policing better, and what are the ties that we can see? And I think really the fourth point of my article might help us get there. And that's that there were police officers who active police officers who actually attacked the Capitol, right? So we know that there were officers, at least 2 have already been convicted for the attack of the Capitol and arguably attack on democracy. But I really think a lot about not just the officers that were at the Capitol building itself, but about the officers who were at the rally that preceded that the Capitol siege. So if you think about what was happening at that rally, what they were rallying to do, the point was to undo the results of the November 2020 election. And so if you think about what that means, that there were, dozens and dozens of police officers from across the country who attended that rally, there's only 2 reasons, right, that you would go to that rally. Either you legitimately believe that the election results are incorrect, right, that the election was actually stolen. So either there are officers who believe that, or there are officers who don't think it was stolen, but they want to overturn the valid election results. So you have officers who are either delusional, or they want to reverse the results of a popularly elected presidential election, right? And so both options are pretty unacceptable for anyone, but particularly for public servants. And so if you think about that, I think it's a really interesting way to think about what's happening in policing. So police should be public servants, right? They get paid to keep people safe, right? And ideally, they're supposed to be protecting everyone in our country. But unfortunately, not just the research I've done around the January 6th incident, but some of my other research about explicit racial bias in policing has led me to believe that there's an us against them mentality in policing. And so that police don't always see themselves as the public servants that we'd like to think they are. I think police often really see themselves at war with the communities that they're supposed to be protecting. And I think you see that in a lot of different ways, not just on January 6th and not just with police violence against people of color. If you think about COVID-19 anti-vaxxers on police departments, the police officers who just refuse to get vaccinated or refuse to wear masks. If you think about police officers who were QAnon followers, and then, of course, these January 6th election deniers, we're talking about police that have a hard time separating fact from fiction, and who don't see themselves as part of the community that they're supposed to be policing and keeping safe. And that, I think, is a big problem for us as Americans, because, like I said earlier, police are the only ones that get to use force against other Americans. And we give them a lot of information. And so it's pretty scary that we have so many officers who really don't see themselves as existing to keep us safe.
So if I understand what you're describing a group of public servants entrusted with far more responsibility and far more privileges than most other public servants, who are for some reason held to a lesser standard when it comes to employee culture, health, and political actions outside of the workplace. How did we get to that point? How is it that police departments are allowed to operate in many circumstances with impunity?
That's a great question. There's a lot of ways that that's come to be. I think it has become very politically unpalatable until maybe the last couple of years to question police or policing or police budgets. And that's allowed police departments to grow in size, number, and power. We also know that police unions are really some of the only worker unions with any power in this country. And that's also allowed police to have a tremendous amount of job security. I mean, think about it. If you told your employer that you wanted to, take off a couple of days to go try to overthrow an election, they'd probably say no, right? And your job might be at risk. But scores of police officers did that on January 6th.
What do you see as some of the things we can do? I mean, I think the historical trajectory in some sense is obvious. As you said before, police forces in many ways have an origin moment around the use of violence against particular communities, and they develop a certain paramilitary identity in some cases, and they've been privileged in the union structure of the workforce. I guess many people, including yourself, have written about that. The harder question for me, Vida, is what do we do about it? What's feasible as a response?
I think that's a very difficult subject. I think there's so many problems with actually reining this issue in because of the way our police departments are organized in this country. We don't have like one federal agency that is governing policing in this country. Instead, we have, a lot of local, state, even county by county police departments. So it's really difficult to rein in what's happened. So I'm not sure I have a great answer. Most of my research has been focused on explicit racial bias on police departments, and more recently, far-right extremism on police departments. And I think there are ways to try to get those types of officers off police forces. I think we need to do a far better job at screening police officers, prospective police officers, before they make it onto the force. I often tell a story about an officer in Little Rock, Arkansas, who was completely honest when he was asked if he'd ever been a member of any white supremacist organizations, and he admitted attending a KKK rally when he was a teenager. And the Little Rock, Arkansas police department said, "Oh, thanks so much for sharing with us," and they pat him on the back for being so forthcoming, and they hired him anyway. Well, he went on to kill a young Black teenager in that city. And the only way we learned about this guy's past was because of the civil lawsuit that followed. But obviously they needed to, and we all, every police firm in this country needs to do a better job of keeping people like that from being police officers in the first place. But we also need to periodically check in and do background checks on officers once they're hired. People sometimes become more more prone to extremism as they age. So, the person you are politically in your late teens or 20s when most police officers get hired is pretty different than who they're going to be in their 40s or in their 50s towards the end of their career. And so monitoring their social media, monitoring their work emails and text messages for sort of keywords that might indicate that there's a problem. I think that's just common sense. And I also think this sort of monitoring of police needs to be done not just by police departments. I think they need to contract with outside organizations to do that kind of thing, because there is I'm sure you've heard the expression, the thin blue line, but there's a real blue wall of silence regarding any police officers' misbehavior. And so it's very common for police officers to protect one another. And so making sure that there are people who don't work with these individual officers who are the ones monitoring, I think those are both really good steps in the right direction to have fewer extremists on police departments.
Right. Well, that sounds like basic checks and balances, but I guess what's your response to the response I've heard from many police officers and others, which is that what you're describing would be an infringement on their freedom of speech?
Well, I think that's a really common response. And it's true that any American can have the ability to say and do whatever they, really say anything they'd like, but that doesn't mean that they can be a police officer at the same time. So it's pretty common in lots of fields for certain employees to have fewer First Amendment rights. We see that for federal government employees, for example, and it's definitely true for police officers as well. They don't have the same ability to share political views, for example, as other members of our community do, but that's a choice they made by becoming police officers. And I think the same is true for police officers who hold extremist views. They can't be the people that we entrust with, violence, weapons, and training, and hold far-right, anti-government, and racist views.
So I guess the final question, this has been so insightful, Vida, the final question I wanted to ask you, and it's a question or a form of a question we always use on the podcast. We like to close on an optimistic note. Our goal is to use the historical and scholarly analysis of our discussion to point to opportunities, especially for our young listeners, ways that they can get involved in making change and use scholarship and history to improve the world. What are some of the positive developments you see out there, the organizations, the activities, the scholarly groups that I'm sure you're a part of? What are the things that people who are motivated and inspired by what you've said, and I'm sure there are many listening, what are the things they can get involved in to make a difference?
Well, I think the good news is January 6th laid a lot of this bare. And I think a lot more people are interested in what's going on with far-right extremism and the threat to democracy that is for all of us. And that's certainly true when you think about policing, right? If people hold a dim view of policing because police officers uphold our laws, they hold a dim view of America. So it's something that we all need to be critical about. And I think I think everyone's just paying much more attention to that than ever before, between, the sort of racial reckoning summer of 2020 and now January 6th, I think there's been a lot of eyes opened across the country. And I think that's a good thing. And I think it ultimately is a good thing for police. And I think police should welcome this sort of critique and internal reflection about what ways that they could do better. Absolutely. And the other thing I think is we need more women on police departments. So if you're a young woman out there who's trying to think about ways to make a difference, we know that that's actually that just having a single woman on a scene actually makes the chance for violence go down. And so I don't know, I'm not necessarily encouraging any more police, but I think the ones we have could be replaced by a group of young women. I think women are only 13% of police departments in this country, and that's something that we can change.
Huh. Wow. Well, that gives us a lot to think about. Zachary, what's your reaction to this discussion? I know this is an issue that animates you and many other young people when you think about the problems of our democracy today. And I know in your travels this summer, you were seeing how other societies handle these issues perhaps better than we do. What's your reaction to our discussion today?
Well, I think it's very enlightening to help us sort of understand how we got to this moment. And I also think one of the things that this helps us understand is that what went wrong on January 6th, but not just January 6th, but in the events of the past few years, is not that there were some people who were trying to overturn our democracy or were trying to spread violence. That's always been there, but that the law broke down, right? That the mechanisms that are and the people that are supposed to protect us failed. And I think we have to recognize that if we're ever going to prevent something like this in the future.
I think there's a lot to that. And I think we can see this actually as truly defending law and order. Right? Law and order is often used as a catchphrase to justify more policing.
Or a dog whistle.
Or and a racial dog whistle. And in fact, truly protecting law and order is, I think, what Vida is talking about. Vida, I want to give you the last word.
I thank you so much for having me. This has been a real pleasure to get to speak with both of you. And I think really the thing that we should all be thinking about is if we're going to reimagine policing, I think reimagining policing in a way that keeps everyone safe is the most important thing we can do. And so focusing on far-right extremism and racial violence, not just within policing, but within America, I think that's going to be the best way to keep everyone safe.
I think that really captures what's at the center of all this, which is the growth and continued festering of far-right ideology and white supremacy, and its connection to many of the other structural inequities in our society. As a democracy, we've long struggled with these issues. That's what our podcast is about. And today we've, I think, gained a greater appreciation of how these issues relate to current policing and criminal justice issues, and some avenues for thinking about how we can improve, if not eliminate, but at least improve the circumstances in our society and in our democracy. Thank you, Vida Johnson, for joining us. Again, Vida is a professor at Georgetown and a scholar of criminal justice and policing in America, as well as a practitioner in the field. Thank you for joining us today, Vida.
Thanks again for having me.
Zachary, thank you for your poem and for your insights as always. And thank you most of all to our loyal listeners for joining us for this week of This Is Democracy.
This podcast is produced by the Liberal Arts ITS Development Studio
and the College of Liberal Arts at the University of Texas at Austin.
The music in this episode was written and recorded by Harris Codini. Stay tuned for a new episode every week. You can find This Is Democracy on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and Stitcher.
See you next time.